What I'm going to be talking about is, very briefly, developmental trauma disorder or complex trauma, what it is, and then I'll talk a bit about effective treatment for it. So what I'd like you to kind of come away with from this talk is an understanding of how pervasive the effects of chronic early maltreatment are on child behavior and child development, and then the implications of that for treatment. Okay, those are really the two things I'd like you to come away from this with, and then an interest in maybe learning more about that. So this is what we'll cover. So what is complex trauma? There are many articles about it, also known as developmental trauma disorder, but in its simplest context, it is chronic early maltreatment that occurs within a caregiving relationship. And that distinguishes it, and this is a clinical construct. Okay? It's not a DSM-IV diagnosis. But I do think it's much more useful than the DSM-IV diagnoses because it captures the pervasive effects of early maltreatment. PTSD, a DSM-IV diagnosis, really only captures a very narrow slice of behavior. And, for example, for many children in the child welfare system who, we might think have evidence of trauma, have experienced trauma, but often they don't meet the specific criteria for PTSD under the DSM-IV diagnosis. Maybe they haven't experienced, for example, a life-threatening event. Okay, so you can't give them that diagnosis, so but they clearly have trauma. So I think this is a much more useful construct than that narrow diagnosis. The domains of impairment, complex trauma causes impairment in 7 domains of functioning. And I'm jumping ahead a bit, but a good assessment, a thorough assessment, ought to address each of these domains. So you don't have to be an expert in each of them, but a thorough assessment really needs to understand the potential impact of early trauma on each of these domains, and you need to be thinking about each of them. Attachment is one. I'll talk a bit about that. Biology, emotional regulation, behavioral regulation, dissociation or defensive functions, cognition, and self-concept. So these are the 7 domains that are impaired by complex trauma. I'll talk briefly about each one. Attachment. Traumatized children often feel that the world is uncertain and unsafe. Okay? Part of the reason for that, if you go back to the definition I gave you of complex trauma, chronic, meaning repeated trauma, early, meaning in the first few years of life, 3, 5 years of life, and it occurs within the caregiving relationship. And that's one of the features that makes it so damaging to the child. Because ordinarily, when a child, or you for that matter, are threatened or affected in some way, for example, during the Storm Sandy, there would be somebody you would gravitate to who made you feel safer and more secure. Could be a partner, could be a parent, but there was somebody you moved to, moving away from the threat, moving to the individual who makes you feel safe and secure. So what happens if the source of threat is that, I'll call it that attachment figure? Well, then you want to get closer because that makes you feel safe and secure, but you want to get away from them. And that's very disrupting and dysregulated to normal development. Biology. Traumatized children may experience problems with movement and sensation. They may be hypersensitive or hyposensitive to pain and experiences. If any of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies done by the Centers for Disease Control, that is another area that illustrates how early trauma can affect functioning. If you're not familiar with that, you ought to just Google Adverse Childhood Experiences or go to the CDC website. And they've done, at this point, hundreds of studies showing the effects of early trauma on things like suicide, smoking, alcoholism, but even things like COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and a variety of other physical illnesses and diseases. Mood regulation. Children experienced to trauma have difficulty regulating their moods. Why is that? Well, you learn to regulate your moods through your relationship with your early primary caregiver. And again, I'm just curious, how many of you have children? How many of you have nieces, nephews? How many of you were kids once? Okay, good. That covers everybody. You know, if you think about it, what happens with a really young child is you regulate their emotions for them, right? Because they can't. And then gradually they come to be able to do that with you, and eventually they can do that themselves. So chronic early maltreatment within a caregiving relationship disrupts that process, interferes with the child's capacity and ability to develop the ability to regulate their moods. Dissociation, one of the hallmark features of trauma, and actually one of the ways that the mind copes with overwhelming stress or trauma is to split off or dissociate the emotional component with the episodic component. And then, of course, what normally happens is we repeat the event again and again and again, and it decreases in intensity. You know, if on the way to work there was a terrible car accident that you witnessed and it was frightening for you, the first thing you probably would do when you walked into work would be what? You'd tell somebody, right? Oh, you can't believe what happened on the way to work today. And you tell somebody else, and somebody else. But by the end of the day, it would recede in emotional impact through the retelling. Well, when the event is so traumatic that the episodic and emotional components are dissociated, and there's no way to bring them back together, that repetition kind of continues either in play or in relationships, but there's no integration that occurs. Okay, so there's a continued sort of perpetual dissociation. Cognition. Traumatized children have difficulty completing tasks, focusing, and we see a whole range of cognitive difficulties because their capacity to take in information and move information from working memory to short-term memory to long-term memory to permanent memory is impaired, because essentially what's going on is when you experience chronic early maltreatment in a caregiving relationship, your stress response system is always active. And I'll have a slide I'll talk a little bit later, but the stress response system, the way the body responds to stress in terms of chemicals and hormones and all that, all of those things are antithetical to taking in new information and learning. Okay? So cognition is severely impacted. And, go back. And self-concept. They have distorted body images. They've been told various things, either verbally or by the way they were treated, what their value is. Right? Essentially, they come to have a self-concept of their self as being unloved, unlovable, basically throwaway kids. Okay? Because that's what early life has sort of taught them.